Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Donald Trump has followed through on his threat. Despite months of talks, just before his August 1st deadline, the U.S. president signed an executive order to increase U.S. tariffs on Canada from 25% to 35% for goods that are not covered under our North American trade deal called KUSMA. This is in addition to sectoral tariffs like 50% on steel and aluminum and some copper products and 25% on autos. The White House claims Canada failed to cooperate in curbing the ongoing flood of fentanyl, and we need to be held accountable, even though the U.S. government's own data shows Canada's responsible for less than 1% of fentanyl at the border, and we invested in a $1 billion plan to crack down on the drug. Trump also pointed to Ottawa's implementation of retaliatory tariffs as a reason, even though those were just in response to tariffs he already placed on us. As we approach the deadline, Trump gave Mexico a 90-day extension for talks, but not for us. So what happened here, and how should Canada respond? Should we punch back or keep our powder dry? I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Mark Warner, a trade lawyer with Maaw Law, about the sticky U.S. trade situation. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Are you surprised there was no deal or extension at the deadline?
Not really. It looked for me for a while that Canada was adding more issues onto the table. For one, I saw was softwood lumber, and I thought, oh my God! So if you think it's bad enough dealing with Trump, now you're going to add a 30 to 50 year trade issue that we have never resolved and add that into the mix. How could that possibly make it easier to get to a resolution, especially one where, from the Canadian producers' point of view, particularly in British Columbia, they think that they're sitting there waiting on a pile of $5 billion to collect. Donald Trump, newsflash, is not going to give any Canadians $5 billion. So I can't see how throwing that one that log onto the fire was going to help. So no, I thought there was I thought that the Canadian government was negotiating in a way that wouldn't lead to the kind of quick wins we saw from other trading partners like the European Union, United Kingdom, and Japan.
Yeah, and we had reports as well that the negotiations at the table seemed one-sided and described as chaotic, where it was just Howard Lutnick repeating the same grievances and demands that Trump was saying publicly without also charting a path forward. So how difficult is it at the trade table when you've got one side that just won't budge in any way whatsoever?
Well, I think the problem here, and I'm not close enough to the Canadian negotiators to know what they sincerely believe as opposed to what they're saying publicly, because this isn't a real negotiation. So if the Canadians are going down there and thinking that it's a real negotiation, it isn't. So that's what I mean by I don't understand what we're doing there. If it's just ragging the puck and putting things off, then I suppose that's worked in the sense that Trump didn't go completely ballistic, and we've lived to fight another day, although we still have the sectoral tariffs. But look, the other countries that have made agreements with Donald Trump have essentially recognized this isn't a negotiation, the GATT or WTO rounds that took 10, 15 years at a time. This isn't a negotiation of NAFTA where you sit around a table and exchange drafts. And even in those negotiations, Canada, to be very honest, is known for not actually putting anything on the table till to the 11th hour. And what Trump is expressly saying, he had experience with negotiating with Canada, actually walked away from negotiating with Canada. We were saved by Mexico last time around, and we managed to pull out the USMCA. So Trump is basically saying to Canada and every other trading partner, I'm not doing that. I've got 4 years. I'm running out of time. I'm just going to give you numbers. Show me what you got. Show me what you've got for me, and I'll see whether it's acceptable. Yes, we're paying tribute to the king, and it's not a trade negotiation. And if we're approaching it as a negotiation, then we basically are not really going to get very far with him.
So why do you think Mexico got an extension, but we didn't?
Mexico, I think, has played nicely to a large extent. They have not retaliated. Canada has retaliated. They have made some major efforts on the fentanyl thing, moving their troops to the border and that kind of thing. That they played along with him, but mostly they didn't retaliate. Now, Carney, the problem that I think that Prime Minister Carney has a little bit is, while he has differentiated himself from Justin Trudeau, who liked to do the in-your-face stuff that really got under the skin of the Trump folks, Trump in particular. Carney has sort of modulated that a bit, but he still does come out with some of this stuff, with the pivot to Europe, with it's not as harsh. It's not done in the Justin Trudeau way, but it's there. And from the American point of view, especially when you throw softwood lumber as the new issue you want to add, and then you've got the British Columbia Premier, because that's the major player in softwood lumber, basically taking pot shots at Justin Trudeau, or at Donald Trump every day. That's not going to help it, I think, because they do see it, right? We do live in a global wired world, and it's not like when Premier Abbey says something that it's not something that people have access to in Washington. So I think Mexico has tried to lower the volume. Query whether at the end of the day we're both largely going to rely on our the USMCA compliance bit. It's true that Mexico had a higher number even before this all began. I think people thought that they were complying in the 80% range, and we were in the 60% range. Now people are claiming we're up in the Mexico range. I'm skeptical about it, but at any rate, that's where I think Mexico is different. It's just different attitude. Hasn't retaliated. Has tried to not tried to put a finger in his eyes, and have actually seemed to try to hear his demands and give him things. Whether they're given things that are enough, it's a different issue. I don't think that's what Canada is doing. I think Canada is really trying to approach it like a serious, real, old-fashioned trade negotiation with a serious, real, old-fashioned president, and that's not what we're dealing with.
Now, before we move on to how we should approach this further, let's talk about what actually is covered here. This tariff will increase to 35% from 25% for non-CUSMA goods, and that's our North American trade deal. Can you give our listeners an idea of what exactly that impacts? Break it down for us with some examples, maybe, of what is and is not covered in our trade agreement?
Sure. So it's a very deceptively deceptive phrase, because it's not. I guess it's not really a question of what's CUSMA compliance. It doesn't mean that it's by a particular product in the way that people would think about it if they go to the grocery store. Here's hair gel, and there's over there lighter fluid or something like that. It's more like what goes into those things that are produced. So it's not just simply you stick a maple leaf on it. It's, did you buy all the chemicals that are inside that lighter fluid how much of that came from somewhere else? What's in the hair gel? And so when you look at it, I think you have to say that clearly industries like oil and gas will be close to 100%, because we know it's come out of the ground in Alberta or somewhere, right? So you can be pretty confident that it's 100%. With auto parts, look, just open up any car or anything you have, you say a lot of that stuff, really, the parts that go into these things really come from Asia. They come from China. They come now from Southeast Asia. And so what the Americans are saying, there are these we call rules of origin, that say how much of a product is actually manufactured in Canada. And so you have to kind of certify that all those inputs that you're putting in. So you have to go product by product. It's incredibly detailed, and that's kind of so. But if, as a rule of thumb, I would say electronics and manufacturing are less likely to be fully NAFTA USMCA compliant, just by virtue of the fact, I think just any average citizen buying things knows there's a lot of Chinese and Southeast Asian stuff in it. And when you get into fruits and vegetables, you get into oil and gas, well, yeah, it's probably more likely to have come directly out of the ground in Canada. And so that those would be the two sort of polls I'd use to distinguish that.
Yeah, and some companies, mainly smaller companies, but some companies decided not to become CUSMA compliant, even though they could, because before Trump's second term began, we had most favored trading nation status, and so therefore the tariff was only 2.5%. Now it's going up to 35%. So there are a number of companies that can become CUSMA compliant who will have to, but they did so because it was cheaper to just take that 2.5% hit than pay for a regulatory a burden of going through all of that, right?
So I wouldn't say that it's smaller companies. I'd say it's some large ones. It's auto companies. I think the auto companies know, in fact, that they probably would spend more money on lawyers and customs brokers to try to establish that their Chinese product is actually Canadian than they would by just paying 2.5%. And I think it's actually the large companies, I think. And then, there may be some small individual broker, but then even with the small ones, this is what the Americans also have been on about with Trump. He got rid of something called the $800 de minimis exemption. That's to say you can ship things across the board. Now, a lot of, our clothing producers were using that to sell the direct to sale sort of into the United States. But again, what makes it tricky for them when they say that they weren't going through the regulatory steps? Why not? Because the underlying fabric was coming from China or somewhere else. And yeah, they couldn't have established it. And that's why they're all upset, because it's not just simply a matter of calling up a lawyer and saying, here, this is what we're buying. And, can you click this box for us? If the underlying inputs are coming from somewhere else, then yeah, you can't make it compliant. It's just the reality of it. And that's part of what we're going to be dealing with in Canada.
So how much of our overall trade is impacted here? I've seen a lot of different numbers floating out there. And how worried should Canadians be with this new tariff and its impact on our economy?
Well, the first thing to say is it's an advantage that we have. So it's a good thing that Trump has so far given us that exemption. I actually was not 100% sure that he would have let us keep it. I thought that the way the government Canada was negotiating might have got up his back and he would have taken it away. So the first thing to say is we're lucky to have kept it. And then I think, what the numbers are, I think it's just what I said before. You have to sort of go industry by industry. My guess is that we're probably in the low 80s, high 70s, if we actually look at it in reality. And keep in mind this is why it's important. It's not just a game here. If the Americans at the end of the day think that what the product that's crossing the border is actually sourced by things that aren't from Canada, then we're not even talking about the 35% tariff. We're talking about 40%. So it's not quite so because that's the tariff. The 40% tariff is what Trump has said to deal with issues of transshipment. In other words, Canada being used. And one thing to know, one of the interesting things, again, go on and on about this stuff, but one of the things to note is that when Trump had first put the tariffs on China really, really high, and the ships were at sea, the container ships were at sea, and a lot of them ended up in the port of Montreal. So you see the kind of problem here is the Port of Montreal then puts out statistics like, oh, business is booming. We're doing great. Well, what are you booming with? You're booming with the stuff that couldn't get into the United States and now from China now is, holding up in Montreal and then maybe being trucked across the border or something. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. So I think we're probably, we're probably in the low 80s, and in some industries that just didn't want to pay the regulatory costs will try to hire lawyers and customs brokers, but for some of them it's going to be tough. And the real cost I think for us now is that uncertainty. We also have the sectoral tariffs that weren't affected by any of this. The steel, aluminum, the auto parts will be affected, and none of that was affected by what happened yesterday, and that will continue. So we're not out of the woods, and uncertainty is the thing that Trump has weaponized. And in some sense, I think he is diabolical enough to not really care what the tariff levels are. Because in some sense, he knows that companies are going to start crossing the border and pulling things back, which is kind of what he wants as well.
More on The Big Story with Mark Warner, a trade lawyer with Maaw Law, in just a moment. Let's start looking a little forward here. What has to give from Canada's side if we want to try and reach a trade deal in the coming weeks or months?
Well, I think that if we want to get out of this with Trump, we're going to have to give him something that looks of value to him that he can declare a win on. And one of the things that they can then hold up to the rest of the world and say, see what Canada gave me, you should give me this too. So there's a lot of concern about China in the supply chain. I think that if we want him to remove the sectoral tariffs on steel, for instance, on Canada, I think that he'll be demanding to see something more extensive about the steel imports coming into Canada, which easily swamp the exports from Canada to the United States. And the Americans are going, well, okay, it's great. You're not sending the actual Chinese steel across the border to the United States. But how is it that you managed to sell below our cost in the United States, Canada, if you're buying all that Chinese and steel from other places below your own costs? So that's a challenge. So I think we have to give him something realistic. I can't think of what 100% it would be, but I do think if you look at the structure of the agreements that people have given him, whether it's some big ticket investment number, I'm not sure that Canada is in the position to do that. I think it's more giving him something on that he can declare a victory on. I think that, I think that the politics of that are difficult in Canada. We know what the Americans' interests are in Canada, dairy supply management. Maybe there's something you can offer him on that without getting rid of the whole system. There's just a matter. Maybe there's a way of saying, to my mind, Canada has not even to this day formally abandoned its position on the USMCA rules of origin on auto parts. We could make for once and for all say that we accept that the Chinese auto parts should not be in the Canadian supply chain and called Canadian. Like, there are little things like that I think would go a long way. But there's a long list. I think you have to give him something that he wants, and I don't think so far, from what I can tell, that Canada has really put anything that he wants on the table, really.
And now there's a couple of schools of thought on how we should respond to this tariff. Some are calling on the Prime Minister to start enacting retaliatory measures, which we haven't done yet under Carney, really, and press hard with some of our leverage. But then there's another school of thought: keep calm, stick to the approach, hold out, and it should work out in the end with these talks. Mark Carney has so far seemed to be taking the keep calm and carry on, not provoking the president approach. What do you think is the best path forward here? Should we start using some leverage, or will that poke the bear too much?
Yeah, so I think I'm in the camp that says keep carrying on, and largely for the reason of what we've talked about already, which is we do have that USMCA compliance exception, which puts us in a privileged position pretty much to everyone in the rest of the world, with the possible exception of Mexico. So there is a bit of it's a bit of a kabuki theater going on here. Trump is saying he's got really high tariffs, and they are hurting us. And they said largely through uncertainty, but we're also through the exemption benefiting. So if we retaliate, I'm almost certain Trump will remove that exemption. I just think that's who he is. We saw that with the electricity bluster from Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. And the Americans are like, forget that. We saw that with the weekend level bluster from Carney when he tried a little bit of bluster around the digital services tax, sending out his ministers to assure us on the Friday that everything was going to be implemented. And by Sunday night, he said, no, we're getting rid of that. So I think we know how Trump will respond. So I don't know that. And then so if you really want to play the retaliatory card, then what do? You say critical minerals. Well, the truth is we haven't really got the critical minerals out of the ground yet. We've got some things that are called critical minerals, like aluminum, which I tend to call the critical mineral from the last war, World War II. That's not really what people are talking about when they talk about critical minerals. So if you want to have leverage, you actually have to get the stuff out of the ground first, which we just haven't done. So that's not much leverage there. So I don't really see it. Uranium, I mean, you want to play around with that. And then the other part of it is, like, to go back to electricity with Doug Ford. I mean, his entire electricity plans are premised on getting rates down to Ontario ratepayers by selling across the border of the United States. Well, if you want to threaten electricity cutoffs, what kind of market are you going to develop there? So it's just I don't see retaliation works. And remember, if it's tariffs, if you retaliate by tariffs, we pay them. I've said it in other contexts. Laws, I think, has been a big thing that they're putting a letter T in front of products that are affected by tariffs. But of course, the only products that are affected by tariffs are affected by Canadian tariffs. So it should be a C, not a T.
Do you think a deal is possible, though?
I think a deal is. Look, we're going to have to put the issue of the larger renegotiation of the USMCA will be reviewed next year. I think that's a broader discussion. I think Canada could get a deal like what some of the other countries have. And for certainty of our automobile industry, it would be good to at least have, the notional tariffs at the level of what Japan and Europe and the UK have got. So, and Korea too, it seems. So I think a deal is possible, but I do think you have to, you can't approach this as a regular trade negotiation and then leak to the press. It's not a real negotiation. It's not a real negotiation. We know that. So you have to be prepared to give him something out of that he wants, and from the smorgasbord of trade issues that Americans have with Canada, find one and use it. Like I said, I don't think that one's going to be softwood lumber, because that would mean, from most Canadian viewpoints, I think Canada getting $5 billion back of the duties that are held in escrow. Donald Trump, newsflash, not giving Canada $5 billion. So that's not going to work.
Yeah, and on softwood lumber, I think both sides made it clear that was going to be a separate discussion and a separate deal, not technically related to the negotiations. But then again, with Donald Trump, almost everything is related to negotiations because anything can be a point of leverage, including the recognition of Palestinian statehood, which you talked about as well the day before the deadline. I guess the last question for you. Carney said in his statement that Canadians will be our own best customer, pointing to his efforts to build projects and tear down internal trade barriers, which could unlock a lot of investment within our economy. We're also looking at foreign markets. Do you think those two together could fill the gap here of what we see so far in our tariffs from the U.S., or is it just a drop in the bucket to what we get with our largest trading partner?
So in terms of where we are today, yes, those things would help with where we are today in terms of the small amount that's been affected, as I said, largely because of that NAFTA exemption. But if you say we're a country of 40 million people, so, okay, at best, if we got that totally optimized, how is that going to replace a market of 400 million? And in terms of Europe, I lived and worked in Europe for about 7 years in Paris and the OECD, and then lived in Brussels, did what's called European law. The Europeans are expanding east, bringing in the Ukraine next step. Where's this market that people think Mr. Carney thinks we're going to sell to in Europe? That there are all these European customers and businesses just waiting to buy things from us. And I think that's the same thing I find when I look at the other countries in the world. They're in like us. They're trying to find new markets to replace the things that the Americans have been buying from them. I just don't think that that's going to replace $400 million. And, geography is a curse. It's also a benefit for Canada. Like the next best option for Canada is always going to be the United States. The last guy who made a serious run to try to test this was Prime Minister Trudeau the first. And by the end of his tenureship, he set in motion what ended up becoming the NAFTA through the McDonald Road Commission, because it didn't work. But we could try it. I don't mind CETA. I remind people all the time, including Mr. Carney, because I'm not sure he's been briefed on this. The 10 of the European Union members have yet to ratify the CETA. So for all of his great ambitions about Europe, and some of them are our best friends, France, Italy, and if you get outside of CETA, you get the United Kingdom. We can't even do an agreement with them. Largely why? Over dairy, for the same issues the Americans have with us. So this idea that there are all these markets that are just waiting for Mr. Carney to charm them to Canadian products, I don't see it. So we have to find a way to make the United States work, and it's still our second best option to me, our best second option, and that's where I am. But all the other stuff is great to do. But I feel that he may be creating a straw man that's going to come back and hurt him if he asserts that there are all these gains from trade and people don't see it.
All right, Mark, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your thoughts on all of this.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That was Mark Warner, a trade lawyer with Maaw Law, speaking with me about the U.S. decision to place additional tariffs on Canada after the trade deadline passed with no deal in place between our countries. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.